This is the No Stroke Podcast with your co-hosts David Dancero and Michael Garrow, helping you to support and thrive in life after stroke. Their podcast is designed for educational and community support purposes only and should not replace medical treatment and guidance of your own health professional team.
Hi, Angela. Welcome to the No Stroke Podcast. So nice to have you here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to join you guys.
Absolutely. So I have been a super big fan of MindMaze for going back to my research in 2016, 2017. And I guess I would classify MindMaze as, the OGs of virtual reality, specifically, obviously, looking at stroke, which is why we're fascinated to be able to sit down with you and have this conversation. But we've given a bit of a background, in our introduction here to you. But for our listeners, again, as we'll dive into this, you have such a unique background. But let's start with that. What's kind of gotten you to your current position with MindMaze?
I started my journey as an occupational therapist over 28 years ago. And I like to say I have over 50,000 hours because that sounds like I'm not as old. And I've worked with neuro patients predominantly most of that time. I started off with hands and shoulders and quickly got bored and then got fascinated by neuro rehab because there's so many things that can go wrong, and became a clinical expert as well as a therapy educator. So I teach vestibular vision and sensor integration, dynamic splinting of a hemiparetic arm. So I teach coursework as a therapy educator. I also have a background in health informatics as well as an occupational therapy degree, and I'm board certified in the United States. I've been licensed in multiple states. Predominantly, my practice has been adults. Occasionally, I've worked with some children, but mostly adults and mostly stroke, brain injury, and other conditions like Parkinson's and things, neuromuscular disorders. So I am a self-proclaimed neuro nerd. I've worked in every setting imaginable, including my own private practice. And I probably learned more taking care of my own aging parents than I ever did as a clinician. So I share that information with folks as well. And I love what I do. I love if I can impact somebody and empower somebody to recover function. It just speaks very near and dear to my OT heart. OTs are kind of unique animals in that we kind of look at the whole profile of the person, not just the muscular, not just the cognitive. We look at the whole environment that the person is in, their ecosystem, and how can we bring things and pull things together to try to help facilitate recovery.
So thank you for that background, and thank you for joining the show, Angela. And I have to ask before we dive deeper into MindMaze and your role there, your company did a nice spotlight on their website, and I wanted to, for our listeners, you describe yourself as you have a nature deficit disorder.
I do. I love being outside. I'm also a captain. I live on my 50-foot sailboat. I sail. I used to take like Boy Scouts out for 6-day scuba liveaboards down in the Keys. I've done boat deliveries from USVI, crossing Bermuda Triangle to Marsh Harbor, Bahamas. I've lived in Alaska, paddling among kayaks, and as well as down in Florida, Crystal River area, Rainbow River. I just love exploring nature. It's so beautiful and it's so diverse. And to me, that's just my happy place. After being born and raised in Bronx, New York, I'd rather be around more animals than people. So I'm always seeking that. And it's funny, I posted something on my LinkedIn profile about how just being in nature just kind of resets the whole brain, as well as listen to bird song. So anything I could experience outside, I'm just a happy camper there. That's my happy place.
Same here. I tell my patients all the time, if they're feeling a little stressed and anxiety is creeping up, go out and get some vitamin O and vitamin N, vitamin oxygen and vitamin nature. Get out there in the woods and just thank you for that. Yeah. Mike, this is definitely your big area of interest. So let's jump in. Your background and a lot of your research is in this area. So maybe we can have Angela give us a little bit more specifically about MindMaze and the mission of?
Okay. Yeah, MindMaze's mission is to accelerate each human's ability to recover, learn, and adapt through advanced neuroscience and technology. And the short version, or I guess a little longer version, but more crystal clear, is like we provide digital therapeutics for neuro conditions, and they're holistic motor and cognitive software-based solutions. They include gamified disease-modifying therapies, disease management, and monitoring. And the cool thing is it's throughout the whole continuum of care, in presence or remote.
Very precise, thank you. And for the listeners who might not be familiar with VR, can we just kind of take a step back? Like let's define what, you know, the virtual reality as a therapeutic kind of feel is,
Okay.
right? And what that experience would be like for a patient.
Okay. So for VR, you know, it means a lot of different things to a lot of people. Everybody thinks of like the, you know, off-the-shelf game goggles, and that's what everybody assumes virtual reality is. But virtual reality actually has quite a few, or how could I say, personas, if you would. So the goggles allow you to have like an immersion experience so that you can plant yourself into an environment. In some cases, there's augmented reality, which is like the Pokemon Go, that you superimpose something onto an actual environment. There is embodiment experiences where your hands become kind of an extension, or your arms or your body becomes projected as an avatar on the screen. And it depends on how strong that correlation is to how well you adopt that persona, as it were, because the brain can look at things, and if you have enough sensory input, it can convince you that is you embodied onto the screen. So for example, if it was a block of wood on the screen, you're not going to think that looks like you. Or if it's turned sideways, you're not going to think that looks like you. If so there's different constraints that have to happen so that you can immerse yourself in the entire environment. And again, there's different types of VR, but basically for us, like as a digital therapeutic for neuro rehab, we use it because it's a tool for the therapist, and the therapist can manipulate it. It has parameters. So compared to like your games, off the shelf gaming, which became really popular, you know, years ago, like the Wii and all of that, which is a great tool. We learned the value of that. We understood the value of that because inherently it was fun. And some therapists were doing the deeper dive and analyzing movements and things like that. But you can't really manipulate it but so much. So a good VR system has parameters that can be modified by a therapist. It requires the therapist's input, modifications, and interpretation. You could actually cause more harm using something off the shelf, as it were, than a prescriptive device tailored specifically to your patient. And to let you know, like the difference, like a digital therapeutic device, digital neurotherapeutics, so like rehab digital therapeutics is designed as a therapist tool and allows the therapist to increase a dose. Neurodigital therapeutics is very specific though, it's protocolized. So there's a whole like rationale from the beginning to the end on how you're going to approach a patient care. And then the treatment is designed to deliver evidence-based interventions. And what a lot of folks don't realize is you have to show efficacy to be approved as a neurodigital therapeutic. So it's like approving a new drug where you have phase 1, 2, and 3. You have trials to prove that it works and has clinical benefit. So that's a big difference than something just off the shelf, as it were. And if you think about like how your limbs are represented in the brain, this is from the work of Taj, our founder, or Tej, our founder, and Olaf Blanc. When they started working together with MindMaze, they said, you know, think about how your limbs are represented in the brain. There's more than one representation. You have the sense of awareness of what, like proprioceptive, where your arm is located in space. You also have the sensation of sight. You could hear if it bump into something, you could sense that coming in. So that's what I mean by multi-sensory approach. You have to have multiple inputs coming in to convince you that the arm is part of your body, or you're projecting an image onto like a screen, for example. And most of our products, instead of using the goggles for the high dose therapy, high intensity, what we found is people don't tolerate those really well. So we actually do a projection onto a screen because we want people to be able to do this at home and do it safely in sitting or standing. The goggles we find just really is too much from a vestibular standpoint. And so using these different techniques, you actually can combine what we know about the brain's perception and like how you identify your body, your arm, for example, and use neuroplasticity to encourage repair through like a high dose, high intensity. You know, a lot of times people, when they go into rehab, traditional rehab, you may move your arm maybe 15, 20 minutes during the entire session. You may move it 20, 30 times. It depends on what country you're in. In the United States, if you're lucky, you get into an inpatient rehab and you get to move it a little more. But generally speaking, you're not moving it a whole lot. And what we know about recovery is that you have to move it a lot more than you think to get recovery, especially during periods of neuroplasticity.
So, you know, it seems like, and you guys have been doing this. When did Omar and the crew start MindMaze? It's been around since
Tej.
Search started. Tej,
yeah, Tej. It's been around about 12 years, and it's been really a lot of research based, you know, collecting the data first and developing the products. So there's been several iterations of different products, and some have been adopted, some have been discarded, you know, over time to find out in favor of the evidence what works.
And you also noted, you know, kind of the different geographies in the markets, right? So in the US, you know, the access to rehab isn't quite what it is, you know, in other parts of the world. But you know, again, for our listeners, where exactly is MindMaze based out of? Is it Sweden,
currently,
right?
They're based in Lausanne, Switzerland. We are going to have a US based headquarters in Raleigh-Durham, North Carolina, in the Research Triangle Park.
Nice.
Which is kind of my old stomping grounds. I lived there for a while and went to school in North Carolina at Duke in East Carolina. And also the global headquarters are going to move to New Jersey as well.
Excellent. Okay. Yeah, because you know, when I first found out, you know, I was living in Dublin, kind of saw a lot of the research, but you know, now in the US market, right? Like, you have a really interesting role as integration manager, is that, or
therapy integration manager.
Therapy integration manager.
So I was actually the first one they hired in the United States besides our head of HR. So I started in March with the company and have been doing clinical up until that point, clinical treatment. So
yeah, let's talk through that quickly. Like, what made you, so this was your first move from, and we've had a couple folks on who've kind of made a similar transition, you know, out of clinical into digital therapeutics, and I think a lot more are looking at it. So maybe, you know, let's talk through that for a minute or two. You know, what sparked this interest in MindMaze, and how'd that transition work?
Oh, it kind of was a natural fit because I was supposed to be an electrical engineer instead of an OT. And my brother lost his left arm in an accident, and I started trying to help him, like, how do you wash your hand when you have one? You know, just the problem solving, the analytical activity analysis that OTs do. And somebody said, you should be an OT. And I stumbled into occupational therapy. Now I found out there's a whole area called neuroengineering, and I'm so excited about that. I'm like, oh, had I known back in the day, that would be so cool to participate in. I've always been trying to improve things. Like I did a year at Duke in health informatics, trying to make that more functional and work with HL7 to create international standards. I have a passion for delivering really good quality care and evidence-based care. And MindMaze kind of found me. And so they looked at all the parameters of being a clinical educator and, you know, an expert in neurorehab and some tech background. I wouldn't say I'm of the older generation. I won't reveal how old, but I've been around a while. So not as tech savvy as some of the younger folks coming out, but I do have some experience with it and can embrace it and understand it. So when I looked at the job description that came across my desk, I looked at it, I said, there's no way this is real, first of all. I really thought it was a scam, you know, like the letters you get from a Nigerian prince, because it was my dream job, honestly, because it hit all the highlights of the things I really love to do. And I could have input and direct products, you know, give guidance on products, you know, weigh in on my opinion. I could educate people and elevate their experience and their learning. So I applied, of course, and was very blessed to receive the approval for the job. And my role as an integration manager is basically to go into spaces. I do demonstrations to educate people on the products and why the products are different than other products, like the experience for virtual reality. So how do you compare this product to maybe goggles or other virtual reality, augmented reality experiences, and why this is different? And I work with the educators, so I create clinical content on continuing ed as well. And so I try to elevate anybody who adopts our products with their ability to take it like to the next level with my background, for example, in vestibular, and then kind of help them correlate with the actual practice. So they could create a template, for example, for balance, and they could do dual task training, which is cognitive and balance. Or if the activity is something as simple as sitting on the edge of the bed, like a good template to use our activities to just be able to sit upright and hold yourself upright. So I help kind of provide the background and then the rationale and the integration into clinics. So it's never a one and done sale. It's an ongoing relationship with our partners. So we come back like month after month and provide that experience and expertise.
I think that's really important, that point you brought up, Angela, about how do you get creative in building these into current workflows? And in your role, can you speak a little bit more to like how does if a clinic comes in or a group that might want to adopt your technology, how do they it seems in the work that I've done in the space that it's always you almost have to have another neuro nerd per se in the clinic that really understands the potential. And you spoke before about the volume that's needed to drive change. And how do you work that in to part of the clinic more traditional workflows now that the training has to be and the understanding of how that's built in? Is that something that starts like would like an OT and a PT find you at like a national conference to be able to try your technology, or where are you at with that in terms of exposing other clinical practices to your technology?
And so,
That's a good question. Yeah,
if maybe it would be great, like if you had an example of one of these like clinics, if you want to just kind of tee it up like that, and then like maybe and as well like with one of the specific products as well, just to kind of like give us a real feel and a real life example.
Absolutely. So the first part of this is identifying what the customer's practice areas are, because different products have different, they meet different needs at different times. So for example, if you're an inpatient rehab, the MindPod is like early onset of movement, the initiation of movement. And it is an experience that is designed to be exploratory in nature and high dose. So, ideally you can get 10 days in at 60 minutes at a time with it. And it's even considered like the 4th hour in the United States in inpatient rehab, because patients can then have some more exploratory motion to initiate, because there's different types of things in virtual reality that can stimulate activation in the brain and reactivating those motor pathways, if you would, through high dose repetition. And MindPod is just a beautiful little environment that, it's on a big screen. It is anything you could do with your hand. It's designed for a hemiparetic hand. So any motion that you initiated, and it's the brainchild of Dr. Krakauer, who's our medical advisor here and medical director for MindMaze. But it is something that you can get a high dose of movement and you just get lost in the game, because it's a really beautiful, there's beautiful music. You're a dolphin, you could chase fish, they chase you eventually you're chasing sharks. So there's all these levels, but you can progress through these levels. And before you know it, you're moving a lot more than you ever thought you were. So again, high dose, high intensity. And then in the other setting would be like outpatient to home. Ideally, the MindMotion Go is set up for that. And that is a very specific treatment plan that the therapist could prescribe. So we use Companion as our platform, web-based platform. And that is where patient information is entered. That's where you could do telehealth consultation and appointments. You also do your actual therapy activity out of the 26 different activities there are with the different devices we have, the peripherals. You could have a therapist plan those. We also have templates provided based on what's called the Fugl-Meyer score, which is used a lot in research for assessment. And so if a therapist is not very comfortable in neuro, because a lot of therapists are very intimidated because it's not formulaic like orthopedics, if this, then this. You have to have a background in it. So it can give you kind of the starting point frame of reference. And that is a wonderful tool for, like I said, outpatient to home to get the high dose, because you're busy playing a game and enjoying the game, and you have clinical validation in compensatory motion capture. So while you're playing the game, it actually captures that motion and also active range of motion. And what's neat is at the end of the game, you get a little report. As a therapist, this is important to me because I want documentation. I want to make my life easy when I have to document, because that's the bane of all of our existence as clinicians. And this is a simple little soap note format, and you could see like how much time was on the game, which limb they trained, if both, any time in compensation, because you're always looking to train away impairment is the first thing. You know, when I started, we didn't have TPA, we didn't have anything, and you basically were what you were. There was no concept of neuroplasticity at that time that was widely adopted. So now, you know, you would just send somebody home and say, okay, you can't use your left arm. I got to teach you adaptive dressing. You're never going to use your left arm. But that has all changed. So now, instead of allowing the compensation, trying to train that high dose, high repetition to get it out. And so the first thing would start with an assessment of what environment is the clinic going to be in? Where is the intentional use of this product going to be? And then we can do a product eval. For MindPod, you can get 60 days to have it on site, use it, interact it, and see if it's a good fit. And MindMotion Go is 30 days. And we come out before we ever set up on the ground. We do a deep education on MindPod, the theory behind it, the usage, the research behind it, and when and how you're going to use it. It's like a continuing ed program, as well as the MindMotion Go. And then we also have the companion set up. So before we ever step foot on the ground, that's all in place, and that training has occurred. We try to identify a super user, somebody who, like you said, is a neuro-nerd like me, trying to engage them so that they can feel comfortable with it. And during a product eval phase, it's really important that we stay in contact with the clinic, with the site. So it's usually weekly. We check in with them, see if any issues, any problems going on, solve those problems, resolve them, and show them other ideas and introduce other concepts. Because first of all, you have to get familiar with the equipment, and then you could build on that knowledge and foundation. And then if they decide to adopt it, typically we'll come out once a month or so to the site, and we provide support, like how is the device being used. We have reports that show you how many activities and what type of activities are being used. So it gives a nice intelligence behind like how the devices are being utilized, because again, I have that operations background. So I try to address that part of it. Like if you're adopting the software, you want to know how well it's being integrated into your clinical practice. That's for the bean counters, right? As a clinician, the companion software is wonderful because in the electronic medical record and trying to make it functional and usable, I explain that part of it with Companion, which is our web-based software, which is wonderful. And then, of course, the clinical education piece on how to use the different devices.
There's only one of you?
Now there's three of us,
job.
and starting on 4. We actually just brought a certified hand therapist on board who I'm
cool.
so happy. She actually has more experience than I do. And while a certified hand therapist sounds more neuro or more orthopedic based, she has neuro background as well. So helping us in product development to identify, because I know a lot about hands, but of course she's a CHT and knows a lot more. But right now we have a gal named Jessica on the East Coast, and she's based around New York City area. And I have Lauren, who's on the West Coast in San Diego. And we have partnerships like with Hopkins, Mount Sinai, UCSF, and we're always looking for ongoing research. So sometimes people reach out to me on LinkedIn because they see my presence on there. Sometimes they hear about us at a conference, like I was just at the North Carolina OT conference presenting digital therapeutics through the continuum of care. And some folks reach out as well. Duke, I just did a presentation at, that's kind of my old stomping grounds. So it just depends. People reach out for us to different reasons. We do have home users that reach out to us, but our products have to be, because they're so protocolized, they have to be prescribed by a therapist. And I will say this, like the MindMotion Go, and I've never had this happen in my career as a therapist, have somebody be compliant as this, but what the adherence was shown was 98% when we deployed these things in the home, because the patient didn't have to get in a car, drive to the clinic, you know, decrease in missed visits and all that.
what stage of like a chronic stroke population was that assessed on, or like is there a
That was a newer diagnosis, and this was during COVID. And what they found is that we could do telehealth visits, right? So you could have a visit in person in the clinic called a synchronous visit. You could do then a second visit during the week, telehealth visit. And then you could have asynchronous treatment because you set up the program for the patient and they just turn it on and they play. It's there in their living room. It could be connected to an HDMI TV. So it's a nice, easy way to just engage. And it's very simple for people to use of all ages. So that was a big thing, is the usability of it and access to it. So you don't have to get in your car. You're not dependent on somebody driving you somewhere after a stroke. You have no reason not to do it, basically. So we could actually monitor that adherence on that companion software. We could measure the progress. We could see the scores. We could see everything as a clinician in the background. So we know if you're doing your homework or not.
Angela, what does that deployment look like in the home, in the support there? Is it,
Okay.
what is the, like if you used one of your products as an example, for maybe specific to stroke, is it something that you physically have to send out someone to make that connection and get them started?
Well, we need, some folks reach out to us through home use directly. And so then we have to find a clinician that's going to provide that care for them, and they have to be open to it. And we document, of course, all the supervision and everything. But then the unit gets shipped to the home. It's very easy to set up. It's about as complicated as setting up a DVD player. It's not very complicated at all. And everything is very explanatory in the connections that are made. You do have an Xbox Connect camera, but that's very proprietary software inside it. It's not your off-the-shelf camera. This is the MyMotion Go. There's a keyboard on it, and that's about it. That's all that's set up. So it's not very complicated. And you need, an internet connection.
Amazing. So we talked about the range of products here that are both in clinic and then in the home. We talked through some of the adoption, the clinical outcomes, but I'd love to now kind of talk about what some of these barriers are that you're trying to get through to ultimately have this be at scale. And I'd assume it goes back to who's going to pay for it, right?
Yep. Always.
Yeah, all the money. So what is your path? And again, let's take the US market as the example, but I would love to also hear about adoption rates in other markets outside the US, if you have any insight there.
Mm-hmm. The MindPod is still being expanded. Right now, its genesis was, in Baltimore. That's where it was born. And, correlation with the Baltimore Aquarium, Omar and some of the fellows that worked on it really mapped out everything really well with the dolphin's motion and the correlation to human movement and embodiment and all of that. It's not 100% direct embodiment because it's a dolphin, but your hand is the avatar, basically moving the dolphin to catch other fish. And it is movement patterns that John Krakauer's work looked at, and what's the typical movement pattern of the upper extremity, and it's mostly in front and freedom to move. And you're not moving anywhere you can't move, you're not able to move. So it's still great, but you could still engage in the game, even if you don't have full range of motion. They do have an exoskeleton that's available too, but that depends, again, on your clinician thinking you're ready to be able to use something like that or not. Okay. And those deployments are typically in a hospital setting. In an acute rehab setting is kind of ideal, or a wellness center where folks like chronic stroke is, a new stroke is like the ideal during the neuroplasticity part, the early onset, right? So we're really trying to give them that high dose, high intensity as soon as they're able to tolerate it, and they're in a rehab setting. So again, like at Hopkins, they're using it in an upper extremity lab. In inpatient rehab, they're using it as the fourth hour. And in other settings, they're having people have access to it after they leave, to be able to commit to come in, like I said, for the 10 days, 60 days, or 60 minutes at a time. So that access there is typically cash-based for that setting. And then, of course, you have your typical standard of care of the 3 hours of therapy. So it's just an add-on. a lot of times you have the therapist prescribe it and assistance from like a rehab tech set it up. So the labor costs are kind of minimal, but the outcomes are really great. So that's, you move people along. So that's kind of tricky. The go in an outpatient setting. So just like anything else, if I set somebody up with a home exercise program, I'm practicing it with them in the clinic. And so I build that as either therapeutic activity or neuro-rehab. So your typical fee-for-service codes. And then when I deploy it to home, right now we can still do the telehealth, right, visits. And also with the remote therapy monitoring now becoming more and more popular, we have products that are going to handle the demands of that, requiring the supervision of the clinician every so often, as well as the product reporting. And that depends on which technology we implement, like the Physiolog, which is a wearable device that measures, I think there's 26 different parameters surrounding gait, just in walking, that it can document and predict fall risk as well. So that's really useful. And that'll integrate into our platform with Companion. So Companion is kind of like the universal platform that all these things kind of plug into. And then if it is deployed to home, you could have asynchronous, which right now you can't capture that, right? But you can give somebody 5 days of therapy a week, and you could also allow them to have free play in other games if they complete that and they're motivated. But we are going after those category 3 codes right now. That begins January 23. And again, it'll cover the cost of the equipment deployed to home is what we're looking for. That's one code. And then the other one is actually the monitoring by the clinician. So if you could combine all of those things, the ongoing monitoring, it actually is a cost-effective measure and it actually pays for itself. But you have to combine some different components to be creative, because right now the market doesn't support that. Right now you're inpatient for 3 days, you go to rehab for maybe 2 weeks, and then you're home on the couch until you can get into outpatient once or twice a week until your insurance allows that. That's not okay. I think the industry
really
has to
appreciate
change.
Thanks for covering that, because that's always been the barrier for clinicians, at least in my space, for reaching outside the clinic walls, is that we're not paid for that time. So I think the potential there and the training and your critical role in kind of championing that effort is so important. So thank you for discussing that.
Yep.
Mike, how
are we doing on time? We're almost getting to the magic one. I would just like to quickly, I mentioned that, obviously being a European company, can you speak to other markets? I spent a lot of time in Ireland and did a lot of research in that area, as well as the UK. Are there Angelas in other parts of Europe?
Yes. We're international. Yeah, we're in several countries, and including India. We're in Dubai,
cool.
United Arab Emirates. We're in Switzerland. We're in France. I'm trying to think where else. Portugal, Spain, and the UK. There's 2 therapy integration managers in the UK, Emma and Ketke. They handle like the North and the South. And they're working on several different, sometimes we have partnerships to explore product evaluation of particular peripherals. Like we want to test out and get feedback. Sometimes we work on partnerships like the deployment to home, like a model of that. Is that going to work in that particular environment? So we're open to explore pretty much anything. We could have a discussion and talk about it, and just to see if it's a good fit for both of us, as we're working together with the client. If like a university wants to do research, like an OT school, for example, I speak to several universities, and sometimes they want to highlight one of our products, or they're on a clinical affiliation and want to integrate it into their research. We always welcome those kind of discussions.
Amazing. Yeah, that's great to hear. I figure, and we're going to be speaking to a group out of Australia in the coming weeks as well. Any partnerships?
We're in Australia. Yeah, we're in Denmark, or in Germany. We're all over the place.
Cool. Well, exciting to hear that.
Each model's different, Each model
and
reimbursement is different. So you have to be very. If you looked at my profile on MindMaze, my favorite phrase is rigidly flexible. So when you're looking at the different payer sources and the different requirements, and everything from internet access to sharing data online, which all our stuff is HIPAA compliant, and very secure, but different countries have different regulations. So here in the United States, a lot of our criteria has to meet FDA approval, right? Like for our products. In Europe, it's the CE mark. So there's different specifications and ISO standards, and
I know, very complex. I know Germany built an interesting kind of reimbursement model for digital health, digital therapeutics, but I mean, I can't imagine the complexity kind of operating in different markets at the stage. But
well, we have like three folks there, me, like clinical researchers, as well as Tim's in background. They're therapists, physios by trade, but they're actively involved as well.
Super cool. Well, excited to see the growth and see this really starting to get access into patients' hands and assist the therapy community. I think we will kind of start to wrap up here. So I think the last question we always ask is our famous magic wand question. And it looks like you've created some magic to have an enormous brain behind you for those folks who are listening or watching us on YouTube. But the gist of it is I'm going to hand you a magic wand. And with that magic wand, you're going to have the ability to redesign the stroke care pathway. Sorry, from prevention all the way through to rehab. You could take it however you'd like. You have the magic wand.
I actually say before I lay my head down for the last time in my clinical career, what I hope to change is the standard of care that goes on right now, because there is no standard of care for neuro rehab. And I want to help define that standard of care that happens. You have Stroke Centers of Excellence by JCO accreditation here in the United States, and there's nothing on protocolizing their neuro rehab. And I think there's a place to at least have a baseline. And I want to have that, and I want to have high dose and high intensity and nothing less. We have gaps when people go home, they sit on the couch, and this is they're literally burning daylight in the brain recovery process. And all of the research and all of the evidence supports that this is the optimal time. This is not the time for people to be sitting on a couch, not getting intense therapy. And so I hope that going forward from the very beginning, as soon as a stroke has occurred, people are getting up, getting moving, and having a high dose, even in inpatient. There are some studies right now in some places they're doing 3 hours of therapy, even before they get to rehab in acute care, and preparing them for that high dose, high intensity, because that's what the evidence says. Why are we not doing what the evidence says? So that's my soapbox. But if you improve the outcomes, if you don't have people, 65% of people after they have a stroke have a non-functional limb. What is that about when we can make that kind of change? That's not acceptable.
No.
And so I hope to be part of that process to define that. Nothing small, go big.
Well, listen, great answer. And if I could have been giving you those virtual high fives as you were giving that answer floating up on the screen, I would have been doing that for our YouTube listeners, but that is so well said. And I really hope that listeners go to the show notes, and because we talked about a lot of products, we talked about your great background. We'll put that in the show notes. And for example, even just the Mind Pod, we talked on the surface about, the visual and the dolphin. You have to go and see on your website, like just that technology, because that to me is so engaging. I was just watching the video going, reminded me of being immersed in like a Disney 3D animation studio, the way it was created. So any closing thoughts before we wrap it up here? Anything we didn't cover, or you did a great job
Thank you.
with your magic wand? And
you mentioned the Mind Pod, and that kind of triggered something for me. So what they found is the recovery occurs in certain environments, like enriched environments. And most of the research has been done that's very task-based and task-oriented, like on primates. So reaching for a pellet, feeding yourself, repetitive training. But what has not been as widely studied and is now starting to be studied is the option for exploratory motion and the way it feeds into neuro rehab. And that's what the Mind Pod is really about. Because if you have an enriched environment, a multi-sensory kind of experience, just like a child learns, you're going to learn the same way and recover. And a lot of the evidence shows that if you have a stroke, like you're looking at something move on the screen and you see your hand, it may not be a direct movement correlation, but in your brain, the firing of neurons that is happening is magnified, is what the research has shown. And I'm happy to share any research with anybody on that. But really understanding that, and what you're trying to accomplish with the patient. And that's where the MindPod really is a wonderful experience. And the other part of it is you have control. We take so much control away from people. Don't do this, don't stand up, don't, you're going to fall, all of that. This is the one thing that people can embrace and empower and have some dignity with, and own. And I always found that if you can give that to a client, that's like the greatest gift you can give them.
Well, it seems like much more meaningful, impactful work than our friend Marcus Zuck over at Meta.
Yeah.
But
well, I love it because I'm not nagging a patient. Move your arm, move your arm, move your arm. Now they own that. It's part of their identity and their ability to recover and control the recovery. So and they can see that correlation too. Yeah, it's
patient empowerment at its finest, and using some amazing technology to support it. So we'd love to have you back. I think it's been a brilliant discussion. Really think this is going to be something our audience is we're going to be wanting to reach out to you about,
absolutely.
Whether patients, providers. So what's the best way for folks to do that?
You could just shoot me an email at angela.greene, Greene, @mindmaze.com.
Awesome. All
and
right.
I would encourage them to look at the website for mindmaze.com as well as MindMaze Labs. That's pretty cool. All the other stuff we're involved with. There's pain management systems coming down the road, work with Parkinson's coming down the road. So again, our platform is kind of this universal platform that we can add some of these other components in. The Intento, the functional e-stim, I love it because patients control it. Like the therapist activates it and sets in the parameters, but the patient can control it as they're actually engaged in the motion and the activation instead of chatting with their neighbors,
Fascinating stuff. Well, thank you for this. We will let you get back. I know you have your lovely European holidays, or European time off that you have.
Yes. It's well deserved, trust me. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, you enjoy it. And again, thank you so much for your time today. It's been
Thank you,
Thank you, Angela.
a pleasure anytime. And if you ever want to do like a Q&A down the road or something, I'm totally open to it. Just let me know.
Great. That's a great idea. We'll probably take you up on that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for putting this out there for people and doing the work that you do. I think it's really important.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a fantastic day.